London, 1846. Snow drifted gently over Mayfair, settling on the marble steps like a veil Juliet wished she could wrap around herself forever. She pressed her forehead to the chilled window pane of her bedroom, watching the flakes slide past the lamplight, as if winter were trying to smother the secret fire burning inside her. She was 16, and for days she had carried the quiet suspicion that her body now held consequences she did not dare name. 3 weeks. That was all that remained before Robert was meant to return. He had promised, on the last night they shared beneath the humid warmth of the greenhouse behind the house. Juliet could still see the steam fogging the glass, still smell the damp earth, still hear the tremor in his voice when he swore he'd be back before spring broke through the frost, that he would run away with her if he had to. That, not her father, nor the distance, nor even the future itself would pull him from her. But the letter had arrived that morning. It wasn't from him. The rigid, angular handwriting belonged to the uncle Robert had worked for in Dover. Juliet read those few lines again and again, each time feeling a different part of herself splinter. He had sailed for America in haste. He wouldn't return. It was better this way, for everyone. The room seemed to breathe with her, heavy and slow. Juliet slid a hand to the locket, hidden beneath her bodice, the only gift Robert had dared to give her. The metal, once warm against her skin, now felt as cold as the letter itself. Inside, a lock of his hair twined with hers, a silent promise, too fragile to survive the ocean now stretching between them. Her vision blurred. For a moment, Juliet pressed her lips tightly together, as if she could trap any sound of pain before it slipped out and seeped through the walls of the house. No one could know. Not her father, not the servants, not even the immaculate walls of that Mayfair life she suddenly felt she no longer belonged to. Inside her, new, undeniable, grew the weight of the nights they had stolen from the world. And still, the snow kept falling. White, slow, relentless, as if sealing, layer by layer, the end of everything she had believed was safe. Robert Harding had abandoned her when she needed him most. And with the cold rising through her veins, Juliet understood that nothing, not her body, not her future, would remain untouched. If you too cherish period stories, those that whisper like old letters and echo like longing hearts, leave your like and subscribe to the Countess's Tales. Your support allows these narratives to cross oceans and reach more souls around the world. And before you go, tell me in the comments which city and country you're watching from. It's always enchanting to discover how far our stories travel. Lady Juliet Darlington, only daughter of the Earl of Carlisle, had learned early that being born among silken crests was nothing more than living inside a gilded cage. At 16, she had mastered the flawless posture, the restrained smile, the calculated silence, everything expected of a young woman raised never to falter. Her mother's death in childbirth had left her in the care of governesses who polished her manners, while her father, forever absent, seemed to regard her only as a responsibility to be managed. But Robert Harding was 17, and he did not belong to that world. He had stepped into her life like the first ray of sunlight after a winter, far too long, quiet, transformative, impossible to ignore. The illegitimate son of a man who never claimed him, Robert had stitched together his own fate through hard work. That winter, he served as an assistant to a supplier who visited the Darlington estate regularly, carrying tools, delivering crates, guiding gardeners. Juliet first saw him beneath the ivy arch at the back of the property, his coat worn, his hands rough, his eyes filled with a silent dignity that spoke louder than any title. 3 months. Only 3 months of stolen meetings at dusk, when the house exhaled and the world felt smaller, made just for them. Whispers among the garden shadows, fingers brushing like the discovery of something forbidden and inevitable. Robert spoke of simple dreams, saving enough to open his own workshop, and Juliet, for the first time since childhood, found freedom in the simple act of listening. But now, standing at the window with snow gathering like silence over Mayfair, Juliet felt the cost of every stolen moment. The letter she'd received that morning, cold, devastating, still rested hidden in a discreet drawer of her writing desk when the door behind her opened. She didn't need to turn. The firm sound of her father's boots on the floor was enough. Her father. "It's decided," the Earl declared, without preamble, without emotion. "You will be sent to the Hampshire estate. You will stay there until certain complications no longer threaten this family's name." Juliet bit her lip until she tasted the metallic edge of fear. His words hung in the air like a sentence. She didn't ask what settled meant. She didn't need to. She felt with the same cold certainty tightening her belly that her future was already being erased, like snow that would melt come spring, leaving no trace it had ever existed. Chapter 1. The Weight of Silence. London, 1856. The streets of Whitechapel returned to the sky the same color as the rain, grey, weary, exhausted from existing. Juliet pulled her hood further forward, hiding her face as she moved through alleys where mud and smoke formed a haze that seemed almost alive. At 26, Lady Juliet Darlington no longer feared for her reputation. That had died 5 years earlier, on the day she abandoned at the altar the Viscount her father had chosen for her. The scandal was swiftly smothered, buried under the considerable influence of the Earl of Carlisle. But nothing, neither her father's power nor the silence he purchased, had erased what came before. Juliet had her own child taken from her arms before she ever heard the first cry. That was the ghost that had followed her ever since, not society's judgment. 10 years. 10 years opening doors that preferred to stay closed. 10 years hearing refusals spoken with pity, coldness, or indifference. Forgotten orphanages, clandestine shelters, institutions where illegitimate children were hidden like dust, swept beneath society's carpets. Her father had taken any concrete clue to the grave. Still, Juliet kept searching. The boy, wherever he was, throbbed inside her like an old wound. Juliet clutched her soaked shawl to her chest, sidestepping staggering men who muttered obscenities. She knew how to walk there. She had learned. Mrs. Davies waited in the carriage 2 streets ahead, 15 minutes before the coachman began to grow suspicious. Rounding the corner, Juliet lifted her gaze to the faded sign, St. Michael's Home for Foundlings, the 13th orphanage in 6 months. She climbed the worn steps, each one echoing like the steps she had taken years ago in a house she could no longer call her own. She knocked. Silence. She knocked again. Nothing. The street remained still, a stillness so thick it felt like held breath. Juliet felt her stomach tighten. Something was wrong. She heard footsteps, heavy, slow. Then 3 shadows blocked the exit. "A fine lady like you," the largest one said, smiling with darkened teeth, "lost in the wrong place." Juliet's heart quickened, but her face stayed calm. Whitechapel had taught her that visible fear was an invitation. "Let me pass. I carry nothing of interest to you." "Oh, you do?" He stepped closer, his gaze raking over her. "That shawl, those shoes, and maybe something more valuable." Juliet backed up until the cold door pressed against her spine. No lit windows, no voices. Not even a whisper of mercy from the street. Mrs. Davies, her son, Robert. The 3 panes collided inside her. The men advanced. Juliet screamed, then she shut her eyes and braced for the attack. The sound came like a bone breaking in the dark, a sharp crack, a muffled cry, the weight of a body collapsing into the mud. Then another impact. Clean, deliberate, brutal. When Juliet opened her eyes, a figure was moving among the attackers with raw precision, quick fists, sure strikes. In seconds, 2 men lay motionless. The third stumbled away, swallowed by the rain. Silence. The figure turned. In the dim glow of the lamp, Juliet saw the outline of broad shoulders, a worn coat, the shadow of an unshaven jaw. Nothing more. Until he spoke. "Are you hurt?" The voice was deep, hoarse, familiar. Juliet felt the world slip for an instant. When he stepped forward and the light finally touched his eyes, she drew in a sharp breath, as if her body recognized him before her mind could. Amber eyes. Eyes that had once promised her a future. Eyes that had vanished without explanation, taking with them everything she had been. Robert Harding stood before her, alive, 3 steps away, 10 years too late, and the past broke open inside her, pain crashing against anger, wounded hope rising like a blade. Juliet clutched the shawl against her chest. Her heart didn't falter. His did. Chapter 2. The Ghost of the Past. Robert Harding had long since learned not to ask questions about those who stepped through the doors of the Crimson Lion. That gaming house survived because its patrons trusted silence, hooded nobles, discreet merchants, men who preferred to settle their debts far from glittering ballrooms. In 3 years, Robert had risen from a mere guard to an unofficial partner, a position earned through long nights, steady fists, and a past no one dared to revisit. But on that rainy night, patrolling the alleys before closing, Robert wasn't thinking of wages. He was thinking of ghosts. The rain had turned Whitechapel into a maze of steam and mud. He pulled his heavy coat up to his collar, a far cry from the threadbare fabric he'd worn at 16. He walked with alert steps, chasing off thieves and steering away drunkards, easy routines for someone who had grown up fighting for every coin. 10 years. 10 years since he had left London with nothing but worn boots, and the letter that had crushed whatever youth he had left. The girl no longer wishes to see you. Forget her. There is a better future for you both if you do not return. She is the daughter of a count, and you cannot give her what she deserves. Those words had haunted him like fever. He drifted between ports and factories, Liverpool, Bristol, Manchester, places where no one asked questions and where a man could lose his own name. He returned to London only 3 years earlier, harder, older, convinced that the naive version of himself had died long before he reached 20. A scream tore through the night. Female. Sharp. From the direction of St. Michael's. Robert ran before thought could follow. His body knew what to do. 10 years breaking up fights had trained his muscles. Turning the corner, he saw 3 men circling a hooded figure, too small to stand a chance against any of them. Rage rose in him, fierce and old. Cowards. He had never tolerated cowards. Grabbing the largest by the shoulder, he slammed him into the mud without hesitation. The second turned too late. Robert's fist met his face with a sharp impact learned through scars. The third fled into the darkness, stumbling. He took a slow breath, releasing the tension little by little. "Are you hurt?" he asked, turning toward the woman. She didn't answer. She stood still, the hood hiding shadows he couldn't decipher. There was a stiffness in her posture that tugged at his memory, something familiar, something painful. Robert stepped closer. The faint lamplight brushed her face, and time simply gave way. Thinness, pallor, exhaustion carved into her features, yet there was in her a beauty different from the one he remembered, less luminous, more profound, as if the years had taken the girl's shine and left in its place a woman made of fractures and strength. And it struck him with the force of a blow. She was marked, but in a way that hurt to witness. Juliet. The name escaped him in a single breath. She looked at him as if seeing a ghost, surprise, pain, a dark flicker beneath her lashes, not longing, not relief. Something broken. The weight of 10 years fell on him like iron. "What are you doing here?" The question came out rougher than he intended. He felt the failure but couldn't soften it. "Ladies don't wander Whitechapel at this hour." "Unless—" Bitterness rose in him, sharp as rust. "You're no longer considered a lady." She stepped back, as if each word carried physical weight. "That is none of your concern," Juliet said, her voice steady despite the faintest tremor. "I appreciate your help, but I don't need you." "Clearly." Robert crossed his arms, blocking her path. The gesture happened before he could stop it. 3 men against you. Bold strategy, Lady Darlington. Does your husband approve of such strolls? A flicker went through her, pure pain, undisguised. "I have no husband." She lifted her chin, drenched but unwavering. "And you have no right to question me." The ground seemed to shift beneath him. "No husband." The letter. "You're different," he murmured, softer than he meant to. "Perfect Lady Juliet, alone in Whitechapel. Life does enjoy its ironies." Her eyes sparked. "You know nothing," Juliet said. Her voice was steady, but the last syllable broke like glass. "Nothing of what I've lost." Her pain hit him in a way he didn't expect, as if something inside him had been shoved out of place. He laughed, but the sound came out rough, marked by wounds that had never fully healed. "Lost what, Juliet? The affection of a foolish boy. I'm sure you recovered quickly, between new dresses and crowded ballrooms." He regretted it instantly. Words cannot be taken back. Juliet stepped closer. "You left," she said, her voice a sharp whisper. "You left for America and abandoned me." Robert blinked, stunned. "I left?" Disbelief tore through his throat. "I got a letter from you, saying you wanted nothing more to do with me, that I should forget you, that I couldn't give you what you deserved." The color drained from her face. "What letter?" she breathed, the words cracking. "Robert, I waited. Until the last day. I waited. But you never came back." Silence fell between them, heavy, inevitable, irreparable. Something inside him gave way, a fracture as old as it was necessary. "Juliet," he began. She lifted her hand, stopping him with a gesture small but devastating. "No." Her voice was a tired whisper. "It doesn't matter anymore. That part of our lives is gone." She turned and walked into the shadows, light as someone who had learned how to disappear. Robert should have let her go. He had reasons, he had wounds. But his feet moved on their own, silent, relentless, as if 10 years had meant nothing. He needed the truth, and more than that, he needed her. Chapter 3. Suspended Truth. Juliet walked too fast, nearly stumbling through the mud as the rain erased any boundary between fabric and skin. Her heart beat so loudly, it seemed to echo against the narrow walls of the alleyways. Don't look back. Don't look back. But the past was moving inside her with steps of its own. Robert was alive. In London. How the look he had given her burned with the same resentment she had nurtured for 10 long years. The carriage waited at the corner like a dark silhouette. Mrs. Davies opened the door, before Juliet even reached the step. "My lady, thank heaven. I heard a scream and—" The words died when she saw the mud on Juliet's gown, the crooked shawl, the terror still clinging to her eyes. "What happened?" Juliet climbed in, her legs trembling. "Leave. Now." The order came harsher than she intended, torn by something between shock and pain. Mrs. Davies tapped the roof. The carriage lurched forward, pulling away from Whitechapel. Juliet pressed her hands against her thighs to steady the shaking. The image of Robert, the rough beard, the amber eyes, the shock, the hurt, glowed like embers newly awakened. But there was more. He was different, marked, stronger, almost unrecognizable, and yet unmistakably him. So familiar it ached. "You left. You abandoned me." The words she had thrown at him came back like stones, but his, "I received a letter from you, saying I couldn't give you what you deserved." Juliet shut her eyes. A lie. It had to be a lie. She had waited, until the very last day, until her father dragged her out of London, until the sickness revealed itself, until the bedroom door closed and the world collapsed with the muffled sound of hurried footsteps, footsteps carrying her baby away. "A letter," she whispered. "What letter?" A gentle touch on her arm made her lift her head. "My lady?" Mrs. Davies's voice was cautious, almost fearful. Juliet drew a long breath. "Mrs. Davies, when my father discovered about Robert, you were there." A brief silence. "Yes, my lady. He threatened him. I know that. But—" Juliet swept the air with a trembling hand. "Could he have done more? Interfered? Prevented letters from reaching me? Or sent others in my name?" Mrs. Davies's breath faltered. She looked down at her hands, twisting her handkerchief until the fabric strained. That gesture, more than any word, answered for her. The world tilted slowly, not like a fall, but like a collapse. "You knew," Juliet said, her own voice sounding distant. "Or at least suspected." Mrs. Davies closed her eyes for a pained moment. "I suspected. Your father was not a man who tolerated defiance. I heard him order a letter to be burned. Her voice shook. And I saw another leave with your name on the envelope. Though you had never dictated a single line, I had no proof. I feared for young Harding. I feared for myself. And I stayed silent. I also believed that a count's daughter could never have a future with a common boy, and you were so very young. The words struck Juliet with a dull, devastating force. A whole decade collapsed inside her. 10 years hating a man who might have been a victim of the same hand that shattered her future. 10 years building resentment on foundations made of lies, and he had been alone in his pain too. Robert had believed she rejected him, that she chose Mayfair's comfort over him, and the hatred she'd seen in his eyes that night, that hatred had roots. Real roots. Juliet covered her face with her hands. Cold fingers met warm skin, a contrast as cruel as the truth sinking in. Lies tore us apart, she whispered. Lies that cost us everything. Then suddenly a thought cut through her like a blade. The boy. She lifted her head sharply, breath caught in her throat. Robert doesn't know, Mrs. Davies. He never knew there was a child. Her companion paled, not with understanding but with shock. My lady, what are you saying? What happened? Whom did you find in Whitechapel? Juliet ran a hand across her face, still feeling the tremor in her fingers. I saw him. The words came thin, fragile, but irrevocable. I saw Robert tonight. Mrs. Davies pressed a hand to her chest, as if holding herself together. Robert Harding, here, in London. My lady, that is impossible. But it's true. Juliet inhaled deeply, trying to contain the storm of emotion. He's alive, and he believes I rejected him, that I wrote that letter. Fear rose next, violent, soundless. How could she tell Robert they had both been deceived? How could she tell him that a life had begun within her and been taken before she ever held it? That she had spent 10 years searching for a child no one admitted had existed? He already hated her, or believed he did. The carriage stopped before the Darlington residence, the same imposing facade that had watched her grow up trapped between rules and silence. Juliet stepped down slowly, every muscle reminding her of the night still pulsing through her veins. The rain had stopped. The wet stones gleamed under the lamplight, as if nothing in the city had changed. Mrs. Davies spoke softly. Rest, my lady. Tomorrow you will know what to do. Juliet didn't answer. She knew there would be no rest. She climbed the silent hall stairs, her footsteps echoing all the way to her room. The locket rested on the dresser, the only untouched fragment of a time that now felt like a dream. She opened it. Even faded with years, that tiny lock of hair remained a stubborn testimony of what had once been theirs. As long as this exists, you will know I am yours. Juliet closed her eyes. It hadn't been his. Never because he didn't want it, but because the world hadn't allowed it. 2 children pretending eternity, now 2 strangers carrying identical scars and a shared absence. She drew a long breath, fear, hope, anger, all of it tangled, forging the courage she needed. She would seek him out. She would give him the whole truth, even if every word cost her breath, and maybe, just maybe, they could search together for the child stolen from them, if he was still capable of hearing her. Chapter 4. Ghosts and Revelations. Robert didn't sleep. He sat in the small room above the Crimson Lion, the modest space he called home, watching London through the fogged window. The rain had stopped, but the thick mist made the city look suspended between dream and memory, like Juliet. As impossible as she was real, appearing after 10 years only to dismantle every certainty with a handful of words. I never wrote any letter. I waited for you. Robert tightened the paper between his fingers. The letter he had kept for a decade was yellowed now, its creases worn from being opened in fury, then in resignation, then in numbness. Lady Juliet Darlington has chosen her path. There is a better future for both of you if you do not return. The handwriting was immaculate, too immaculate. He brought the paper closer to the lamplight, frowning. It lacked the tiny tremors he remembered from the notes Juliet had scribbled in the greenhouse. the way she hesitated before every curve of a letter, as though the world might somehow read her secrets. At 16, wounded and humiliated, he hadn't wanted to notice. Now he couldn't ignore it. A thread of anger stirred, slow and hot, like an old ember catching flame. 10 years believing he'd been cast aside. Years building walls around his own heart, and perhaps it had all begun with a lie. Why? The Earl. When Robert received that letter, he had convinced himself London was too small for both of them. So he vanished. Not out of cowardice, he clung to that, but because he believed Juliet had made her choice, and he, foolish as he'd been, had simply respected it. If he'd known it was a lie. Robert stood abruptly, frustrated with himself, pushing the thought away. Thinking wouldn't change anything. He needed answers. The sky was beginning to lighten when he descended to the hall. James was already arranging chairs, as he did every morning since Robert's return to London. "You look like you duelled ghosts all night," the older man remarked, barely glancing up. "Something like that," Robert muttered. He trusted James more than anyone. Perhaps that was why his voice came out steady. "I need information. About someone from high society." James set the cloth down slowly. "What kind of information?" "Lady Juliet Darlington, the late Earl's daughter." The name scraped his throat. "I want to know what people say about her. Marriage, scandals, everything." James's expression closed into a mix of caution and sympathy. "That story isn't a light one, boy." "Did I ask for lightness?" Robert snapped. James sighed. "She was promised to a wealthy viscount, arranged marriage. On the day of the ceremony, she simply didn't appear, left the man at the altar. The scandal was buried thanks to her father's influence, but burying isn't the same as erasing." Robert felt his stomach drop. "Why?" "No one knows." James wiped the table, his hand faintly trembling. Her reputation never recovered. Many doors closed to her after that. And then the rumors started, strange ones, people swearing they saw her in Whitechapel, Limehouse, always alone, like she was searching for something. A pause. Or someone. Robert clenched his fist. "Anything else?" James hesitated, which was answer enough. Only old whispers. When she was very young, there was something serious. The Earl sent her to the countryside in a hurry. No one ever learned what happened. Robert turned away before James could ask more. He stepped into the street, the scent of wet stone mixed with chimney smoke. He walked without aim until his thoughts settled, cold, relentless. A young lady shipped away in the height of a scandal. The same lady who left a groom standing at the altar years later. The same who wandered through Whitechapel like a lost soul, searching for something no one could name. And before any of this, a winter when they had given themselves to one another, too young to grasp the weight of consequences. A thought rose in him, impossible to silence. Robert stopped in the middle of the pavement, ignoring the young man who cursed while swerving past. Had Juliet been pregnant back then? Had the Earl hidden her away afterward? Was her search now tied to that? He braced a hand against the brick wall, trying to draw breath. A child, a son or daughter, 10 years, lost somewhere in London. Guilt hit him like cold water. If only he had tried to see her one last time. If only he had doubted the letter. If only he had been less boy and more man. But it was too late. When he lifted his head, he held only one certainty. He would not live on guesses any longer. He walked toward Mayfair. The Darlington mansion rose before him, imposing and quiet, a monument to everything he had never been allowed to dream of. At 16, he had imagined crossing those doors as an equal. Now he came with nothing but truth and a devastating suspicion. He climbed the steps. He knocked before fear could drag him back. The butler opened with practiced coldness. "Lady Juliet is not receiving visitors." Robert raised his hand and held the door firmly. "Tell her," he said, each syllable carrying 10 years, "that Robert Harding needs to speak with her, about something that happened in the winter of 1846. Chapter 5. Truths That Bleed. Juliet was in the library when the butler entered, his face a mask of contained disapproval. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Robert in the shadows of Whitechapel, broader and taller than in their youth, hatred burning in those amber eyes. But there had been something else when she mentioned the letter, confusion, and a pain as old as her own. "My lady," the butler cleared his throat, "there is a gentleman at the door. He insists on speaking with you, about something from the past." Juliet's heart lurched. She already knew. "Robert Harding?" she asked, her voice softer than she meant it to be. The butler's frown deepened. "He did not present himself as a gentleman, milady, but yes." "That is the name." Juliet closed the book she had been pretending to read. Her hands trembled. Part of her wanted to send him away, lock the doors, and let the past rot outside. But the other part, the one that had spent a decade combing London in search of their child, knew there was no escape left. "Show him into the library, please." The butler hesitated, social horror flashing in his eyes for a brief moment. Even so, Juliet was the mistress of the house. He bowed, stiffly, and left. She rose slowly, smoothing the simple morning dress she wore. Embroidered silks and structured skirts had long since lost their purpose. There were no balls, no suitors, no stage on which to display perfection. She stepped closer to the mirror above the mantel. The woman reflected there was pale, too thin, with deep shadows beneath her eyes. She was no longer the 16-year-old girl who had run to the greenhouse. Footsteps sounded in the corridor, heavy, inescapable. Juliet drew a breath and turned as the door opened. Robert stepped in, and for a moment it felt as though the room shrank around him. In daylight, she could better see the man he had become, the hard line of his jaw, broad shoulders beneath a plain but well-kept coat, hair a little longer tamed. His calloused hands clenched his hat too tightly, hands that knew the weight of work. But it was his eyes that struck her. Still amber. Still capable of dismantling every defense she had learned to raise. "Lady Darlington," he gave a minimal bow, almost a mockery of etiquette. "Mr. Harding." Juliet kept her voice steady. "I did not expect to see you so soon. I couldn't sleep." Robert took a step closer. "I spent the night thinking about what you said, about the letter, about you having waited for me." Silence gnawed at the edges of the room. Juliet felt the weight of the words that had yet to be spoken. "I never wrote to tell you I didn't want to see you," she said at last. "I never chose anyone in your place. I would have waited as long as it took." Something flickered across Robert's face, a flash of pain, before he pulled a yellowed sheet of paper from his coat pocket. "This letter reached me in Dover," he said, extending it to her, "days after I left. It said you no longer wanted me. It bore your name at the end." Juliet took the paper with trembling hands. The cold words blurred for a moment before her eyes. She moved closer to the window, letting the clear light fall across the ink. The handwriting was elegant even, far too perfect. It lacked the slightly too long tail of her J, the tiny hesitations that always betrayed her. And as she traced the shapes of the letters, something in the stroke felt painfully familiar. The same hand that had corrected her essays, the same that signed estate documents. "This isn't my handwriting," she whispered. "My father, he always read my letters. Sometimes he rewrote them for my own good." She ran her finger over the signature, her stomach twisting. "This is his hand, not mine." "I know." Robert's voice came out hoarse. "I didn't want to see it at the time. I was too full of blood and wounded pride. But yesterday when I saw you, and after hearing James speak of the scandal, of the groom left at the altar, of your wanderings in Whitechapel." He drew a breath. The pieces began to move. Juliet felt the color drain from her face. He knew, or almost. "There was another reason my father wanted you gone," she said, each word torn from a painful place. "It wasn't just your birth. He discovered something that made any future between us impossible." Robert didn't move. Only his breathing grew a little faster. "Say it." Juliet crumpled the paper slightly between her fingers, crushing the lie that had stood between them. "I was expecting a child." The words emerged stark, unadorned. "Your child. Our child." The silence that followed wasn't merely the absence of sound. It felt as though the entire world had stopped to match the erratic pounding of his heart. Robert staggered a step, his hand reaching back blindly for the bookcase. His face went pale, then flushed, as if too many emotions fought for space at once. "A child," he echoed, the word breaking in the middle. "We had a child. And I didn't know." Juliet closed her eyes for a moment, breathed, and went on. "I never had the chance to tell you. My father sent me to Hampshire the very next day. I was kept practically a prisoner until the birth." The memory rose in her like fever. "When it was over, I fainted. I woke hours later. The bed beside mine was empty. I only heard the midwife whisper that it was a healthy boy, before they took him." Robert covered his face with both hands. His shoulders rose and fell in uneven breaths, as though the air itself had grown too heavy. "Where?" he managed at last, his voice rough. "Where did they take our son?" "I don't know." Tears finally found their path. "My father never told me. He only swore the boy would be placed somewhere appropriate, that he would have a better life than we could give him. When he died, he took every clue with him. No records. Nothing. Only silence." She walked a few steps away, as if she needed distance to go on. She crossed to the writing desk by the window, opened the top drawer with still shaking hands, and took out a small velvet bundle, worn at the edges. Returning to him, she felt her heart pound so hard it seemed to echo against the walls. "There is only one thing I know about him," she said, her voice lower. "One thing I was given as the only proof he might still be found." She unwrapped the bundle. Silver glinted in her palm, a small delicate brooch bearing the family crest, a rampant lion on a parted shield, the rose of Lancaster in the corner. "When I awoke, after the birth," she went on, "Mrs. Davies told me in secret what she had managed to do. My father forced her to stay with me through the entire labor. She couldn't stop them from taking the baby, but when they dressed him to carry him out, she slipped a brooch identical to this one between the folds of his swaddling. The matching piece." Juliet closed her fingers around the brooch for a moment, as though gathering courage from the feel of it. "These were a pair," she explained. "They were my mother's, kept with her things in Hampshire. The other brooch went with the baby. It's the only way I have of knowing one day that he is him." Robert stepped closer, as if crossing sacred ground. He took the brooch from her, carefully, holding it between thumb and forefinger. He studied the lion, the shield, the rose, as though he could force the metal to give him answers. "So this is what you've been searching for," he said at last, his voice raw. "Not just a face, not just a name, a 10-year-old boy, and a tiny piece of silver fastened to his clothes, forgotten in a pocket, tucked away in some box." "That's why I ask," Juliet murmured. "In every orphanage, in every house. Not only for a boy of a certain age, but for one who arrived with a silver brooch, some crest, something that doesn't belong in the poverty around him. So far, no one has recognized the description." Robert curled his fingers around the brooch, as though he held more than metal. "This gives us something," he said, a new hardness in his voice. "It isn't much, but it's more than nothing. If that brooch is still with him, or with whoever took him in, there's a trail. And even if it was sold or lost, knowing it existed already points to the kind of place he was sent." Juliet nodded, feeling her throat burn. "It's all I have." She glanced at his closed hand. "This piece, and the certainty that he breathed, that he cried, that he was taken from me before I could hold him. The rest, I've been feeling my way through the dark." Robert looked at her, and for an instant she saw not the hardened man before her, but the 16-year-old boy who had promised her the world in the shelter of the greenhouse. Only now there were no foolish promises in his eyes, just an old weariness and a new resolve. 10 years, he said quietly. 10 years you've walked alone through places you should never have had to set foot in. 10 years I believed a lie and hated you for something you never did." He drew a long breath. "I can't give that time back, but I can promise you something else." He opened his hand again, glanced at the brooch, then closed it firmly around the piece. "Our son is somewhere in this city, Juliet. Maybe still with this brooch, maybe not. But he exists, and he will no longer be searched for by you alone." Juliet's knees weakened. She had to steady herself against the edge of the desk. "That's why I was in Whitechapel," she whispered. "Why I left my betrothed at the altar. Why I let society call me insane, ruined, lost. I chose to be a walking scandal, a pariah, because that way no one tried to shape me or watch me anymore." She lifted her gaze, her voice shaking. "Free from expectations and closed doors, I could look for him. No one had the right to stop me. No one had the right to point a finger." Robert closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, the blind hatred she had seen before was gone, replaced by something more complicated. Shared pain, divided guilt, and a purpose hard as iron. 10 years alone, he said again, more softly. But no more. He tightened his grip on the brooch. "We will find him, Juliet. Together. It is the only promise I dare make. And the only one I intend to keep." She looked at the small piece of silver now hidden in his hand, a silent proof that once someone had dared defy the Earl in secret. For the first time in 10 years, Juliet felt something that wasn't only pain or guilt or exhaustion. It was small, fragile, almost shameful to name. Hope. Chapter 6. The Weight of Fatherhood. Robert left the Darlington residence on unsteady legs, the small silver brooch burning in his pocket as if it were red hot. He had a son, a 10-year-old boy who somewhere in London wore, or had once worn, the Darlington crest hidden among fraying cloth or in a patched-up pocket. The idea was too large, too heavy to fit inside his chest. He walked aimlessly through Mayfair, his hand pressed over the brooch through the fabric of his coat. Juliet had kept it for years. It was all she had, the only proof, the only clue. Now it was also all he had, one solid trace of a life ripped from them before it had even begun. The anger came back reshaped, not at Juliet. She had never been the true culprit, and he saw that far too late, but at the Earl of Carlisle, at an entire system that punished women and children for sins powerful men invented, and inevitably at himself for believing a forged letter and disappearing when Juliet needed him most. He stopped by a small park. Children ran beneath the watchful gaze of governesses, laughing, shoving, squabbling over games that ended as quickly as they began. Boys in clean coats and polished shoes. Could his son be among them? Or was he somewhere darker, wearing too many clothes for warmth and too few for dignity, perhaps carrying a small silver brooch buried in the lining of a worn-out pocket? Robert took the brooch from his pocket and studied it in the clear daylight. Cold silver, the rampant lion, the rose of Lancaster in the corner of the shield. Juliet had carried it for so long as if it were her own heart. And Mrs. Davies, on a night of terror and blood, had slipped its twin between the baby's swaddling before they took him away. It wasn't much, but it was something. He put the brooch away carefully and drew a steady breath. He knew London in ways Juliet never could. Not the London of ballrooms, but the London that lived in the shadows. The London of quiet houses kept afloat by private donations, places where inconvenient children were tucked out of sight and forgotten as easily as a debt. And he knew one place in particular, a place he had been funding in secret for years, ever since he returned to the capital, St. Catherine's Home, a modest house in Southwark that took children in without asking for names or histories, a house Robert visited every month, leaving money because he saw himself in those children, sons and daughters of no one, living under the shadow of other people's shame. Could his own son have passed through there? The chance was slim, but Mrs. Thompson, the woman who ran the place, knew the invisible routes along which children were pushed out of the world's sight. Robert turned, his mind made up. He crossed the bridge, leaving behind Mayfair's elegant order, and entered the narrower streets of Southwark. The smell changed. Smoke, river, stale bread. But it was a familiar smell, one he understood far better than the quiet opulence of the house he had just left. St. Catherine stood on a side street, marked only by a small wooden sign. Two little girls played on the front steps. They glanced at him with curiosity, whispered to each other, then went back to their game. He knocked. Mrs. Thompson opened almost at once. Her lined face broke into a warm smile. "Mr. Harding, what a pleasant surprise. Do come in." The house was small but tidy, smelling of soup and fresh bread. Children's voices echoed down the corridor, a brief cry, a burst of laughter, uneven footsteps, the sound of a house that, despite everything, was alive. Something in Robert tightened. Children sheltered, fed, seen. It was all he wanted, at the very least, for the child he had yet to meet. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, following her into a simple room, "I need your help. I need information." She studied him with sharp, knowing eyes. "About one of the children?" Robert hesitated only a moment before taking the brooch from his pocket. The silver flashed like a contained bolt of lightning in his hand. "About a particular child," he corrected. "A boy. He would be 10 now. He was taken from his mother at birth, son of a nobleman, a count. He was likely placed somewhere discreet, one of those houses nobles use when they don't want certain matters brought to light." Mrs. Thompson took the brooch carefully and examined it. "Darlington Crest," she murmured. "Very old family, very proud." She lifted her gaze to his and, understanding, softened her features. "This boy, he is your son." It wasn't a question. Robert opened his mouth, but the word stuck in his throat. At last he only nodded. "Oh, my dear boy." She handed the brooch back with gentle fingers. "How long has his mother been searching?" 10 years, Robert answered, his voice low, rough. 10 years alone. I only found out yesterday. She gave me this." He closed his fingers around the brooch. "It's all we have." Mrs. Thompson was silent for a time, then sighed heavily. "There is a place," she said at last. "Far less known than this one. Hartley House. It's somewhere between Southwark and Bermondsey. It's funded by donations from noble families who wish to deal discreetly with problems like this." Robert's heart thudded hard. He might be there. It's possible. Far more possible than in any ordinary orphanage. She frowned. When they want to be sure the child is well looked after, but kept far from inconvenient eyes, that is where they go. "But, Mr. Harding," she paused, "prepare yourself. Children are moved, adopted. Sometimes—" She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Fear sliced through his chest like a knife. He tightened his fist around the brooch. "Where is it?" he asked. She gave him detailed directions. Street names, corners, a discreet gate, a house without a sign. He memorized every word as if carving the route into his own skin. They spoke for a few minutes about the running of St. Catherine's, small repairs, stubborn leaks, the kitchen needing a new stove, simple matters that kept the world from collapsing under the weight of its tragedies. But Robert barely heard them. The information about Hartley House pulsed under his skin like a second heartbeat. When he left St. Catherine's, the sun was already sinking low over the rooftops, casting everything in a tired gold. He looked toward Bermondsey, and the urge to go there at once surged like fever, fierce and reckless. But no. Juliet needed to know. This wasn't his alone. It was theirs. And Robert would not walk through those doors without giving her the chance to stand beside him, whether they found a child's face or yet another emptiness. He pressed the brooch in his pocket, the small piece of silver that had survived everything, and started back toward Mayfair. Hope was dangerous. It could devour a man whole. But for the first time in many years, he wasn't carrying it alone. And for the first time since his youth, he allowed himself to imagine a boy with amber eyes or blue, a boy who might keep, in a hidden pocket, on a makeshift cord, or lost at the bottom of a drawer, a silver brooch with a rampant lion, waiting, without knowing it for them, waiting to be found. Chapter 7. The Path of Hope. Juliet couldn't eat her dinner. She sat at the table, far too large for 2 people, pushing her food from one side to the other while Mrs. Davies watched her with that tender serenity of someone who had carried unbearably heavy secrets out of love. The brooch, the twin of the one that might still be with her son, remained in the library, yet its weight pulsed inside her like a second heartbeat. 10 years of blind searching, and because of Mrs. Davies's quiet courage on that distant night, she at least had a clue. A mark. A chance that existed only because someone, moved by sheer compassion, had dared defy the Earl in secret. Juliet knew that without that woman she would have nothing at all. That thought, deep, aching gratitude, was the only thing keeping her upright. Still, fear whispered, what if it was too late? What if the brooch had been sold, lost, torn away? What if 10 years had erased every trace of the boy? A sharp knock pulled her from those thoughts. Sounds in the entryway. Firm steps. The dining room door opened, and Robert appeared, carrying with him the cold, damp air of the fog outside. His coat was wet at the shoulders, his eyes sharper than she remembered. "I found something," he said without preamble. "A place. Hartley House." Juliet stood so quickly the chair scraped against the floor. "What? Where?" "In Suffolk, at the border of Bermondsey." He stepped inside but refused the offered chair with a brief gesture. "It's kept by private donations. Noble families use it to discreetly resolve certain problems. Children sent there don't raise suspicion." Juliet's heart pounded so fiercely it echoed through her bones. "How did you discover it?" "I spoke to someone I trust." His amber eyes locked onto her blue ones. "Juliet, if your father wanted the child hidden but well cared for, that is exactly the kind of place he would choose. Southwark. It had been there all along, and she had never known to look in the circles where Robert moved so naturally. "We have to go." "Now," she said, her voice breaking. "Juliet," Mrs. Davies intervened gently. "Places like that do not receive unannounced visitors at night. Tomorrow morning—" "Tomorrow could change everything," Juliet's voice cracked. "I lost him once. I will not lose him again because of one more night." Robert stepped close and laid his hands on her shoulders, steady but gentle. "Listen to me." His voice was low, controlled. "If we go now, they'll suspect us. They'll hide names, records, anything that could help. Tomorrow, at first light, we'll have a real chance at answers." Juliet closed her eyes. She wanted to run, break down doors, beg whoever she had to. But he was right. First light was better than no light at all. She drew a breath and nodded. "First light, then." "First light," Robert agreed. "Keep this for now." He returned the brooch to her. She hesitated for half a heartbeat. Then, almost without knowing how it happened, she pulled him into an embrace. Quick, restrained, but warm, firm, unexpected. Robert lowered his chin to her hair, breathing in the scent of lavender and something familiar he had thought lost forever. When they pulled apart, something wordless passed between them. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but something new, something built in shared grief. "Rest," he said. "Tomorrow will be hard. And remember, he may not be there and we might have to keep searching." "I know," she replied. "It will just be another door, and I know there will be others to knock on." Robert nodded and left with the promise to return before dawn. The house fell into silence. Mrs. Davies touched Juliet's arm. "Come, my lady. I'll prepare some tea." Juliet followed her into the library, where the fire burned low. She sat while the older woman arranged the cups with her calm, familiar gestures. "You never lost hope," Juliet murmured, watching the flames glint on the brooch's silver. "Even when I doubted everything." "Because I knew you would never give up," Mrs. Davies replied. "Even when you seemed shattered, you kept walking." Juliet closed her fist around the brooch. "Every day I wonder, what will I say to a child of 10 who has never seen me, who was torn from me the moment he was born?" "You'll tell him the truth," the older woman said calmly. "Children know when someone speaks from the heart, and if he rejects me, then you will fight for as long as it takes." Juliet shut her eyes, letting the fire's warmth touch her pale skin. "And Robert?" The question escaped before she could stop it. "I don't know if I see the boy I loved, or the man the world made of him." Mrs. Davies smiled softly. "I believe you saw who he is when he faced 3 men for you, and when he promised to search for the boy. Some actions speak louder than any past." Juliet tucked the brooch into her dress pocket. Something inside her shifted, slowly but inevitably. She didn't sleep. She didn't even try. Before dawn, she was ready. Simple dress, heavy cloak, hands cold despite her gloves. When Robert knocked, his eyes carried the same sleepless vigilance. "Ready?" he asked. She only nodded. The journey to Suffolk felt far too long and far too short all at once. Juliet watched through the carriage windows as the neighbourhoods changed, first the distant elegance of Mayfair, then narrower, humbler streets, until poverty appeared without apology. Then at last, they saw it. Hartley House. Red brick glowing in the newborn light, immaculate windows, and a courtyard where children played, small silhouettes unaware of the weight these two carried with them. Juliet held her breath, searching for anything, any familiar trace, any echo. Robert touched her arm gently. "Easy," he murmured. "One step at a time." They stepped down. Robert knocked. The door opened slowly, revealing a middle-aged woman with a cautious yet polite gaze. "Yes? How may I help you?" And everything began. Chapter 8. The Meeting. Hartley House did not look like a place where secrets hid. Clean brick walls, symmetrical windows, a modest, well-kept garden. And yet Robert felt the weight of the moment as if he were standing before a silent tribunal. The woman who opened the door wore her hair in a severe bun, her hands rough from work, but it was her eyes, sharp, guarded, trained to protect, that made him straighten his shoulders. One wrong step, and that door would close, perhaps forever. "Good morning," he said, keeping his voice steady. "My name is Robert Harding. We're here seeking information about a child who may be under your care." The woman's eyes narrowed. "Hartley House does not discuss its residents with strangers, sir. Our purpose is to offer shelter and discretion." Robert drew a quiet breath. This wasn't the time for confrontation. He stepped slightly aside, revealing Juliet behind him. Mrs. Fletcher, now formally identified, changed. Not much, but enough. Recognition. A flicker of memory. Juliet's name, the rumours, the years of searching. "Lady Darlington," she said, surprise and caution woven together. "You here?" Juliet lifted her chin. Her hand trembled only once before she steadied it. "I am," she replied with quiet resolve. "I've been searching for my son for 10 years, and we believe he may have passed through this house." The silence that followed was a battle fought only in the woman's eyes. Duty versus compassion. Secrecy versus justice. Then Robert took a small coin pouch from his pocket. "This isn't a bribe, Mrs. Fletcher," he said, opening it just enough to show its contents. "It's for the children, no matter what happens here today. All we ask is the chance to look." She exhaled slowly, a breath that carried years of responsibility. "Come in," she said at last, opening the door. "But I ask for discretion. We have small lives to protect." The inside of the house smelled of soap and drying paint. Children's voices drifted from upstairs, reciting something in unison. Juliet pressed her gloved hands together as if the gesture alone kept her standing. Mrs. Fletcher led them to a small, austere room. "When was the child born?" she asked as she sat. "November 1846, Juliet answered, her voice low but steady. "A boy. He was taken from me a few hours after birth." The woman nodded, stood, and left the room without another word. Juliet trembled. Robert reached over, covering her hand with his. "Breathe," he murmured. "Whatever we find, you won't face it alone." She blinked, tears rising. "And if he rejects me?" "Then we'll fight for him," he said firmly. One day at a time. Footsteps echoed down the corridor. Mrs. Fletcher returned carrying a large leather-bound ledger and a small box. She sat, opened the book. The old pages rustled like held breaths. "November of 1846, she murmured. 3 boys arrived that month, 2 with surnames, and this one—" Her finger stopped. Juliet froze. "A newborn with no name," she continued. "Accompanied by a generous contribution from the Earl of Carlisle, with explicit instructions that the child's origins remain confidential." Juliet covered her mouth. Robert felt the impact like a blow. "Is he still here?" Robert asked, because Juliet couldn't. "He is. Mrs. Fletcher closed the ledger. "He was never adopted. Boys without full surnames rarely are. But he's bright, kind, very dedicated." Juliet shut her eyes, fighting dizziness. "What do you call him?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Simon," Mrs. Fletcher replied. "Simon Carlyle." The name dropped into the room like a stone, splitting everything into before and after. But there was more. Mrs. Fletcher opened the box. Inside lay a silver object. A brooch. The perfect twin of the one Juliet carried. The world seemed to stop. Juliet pulled her own brooch from her pocket, her hands trembling, the metal cold as old truth, and placed it beside its match. 2 rampant lions, 2 Lancaster roses, 2 fragments of a past violently torn in half. "I believe," Mrs. Fletcher said gently, "that answers your question." Juliet's knees buckled. A sob tore free, the first in years that she didn't swallow back. Robert caught her before she collapsed. She didn't make a scene. She simply cried, silent tears from a wound that had never healed. Mrs. Fletcher waited. Then she said, "I'll bring him in." A measured pause. "But remember, to him, you are strangers. He owes you nothing." It wasn't a warning, it was protection, and it hurt to hear it. Light footsteps approached. Juliet stood, though her hands shook. Robert stood beside her, unmoving, a pillar against a storm. The door opened. Mrs. Fletcher entered, and behind her a boy. Robert felt his heart stop. Juliet pressed a hand to her chest. The entire world fit into a single breath. A thin boy, but healthy. Dark brown hair falling stubbornly over his brow. Eyes, deep amber eyes that carried the same mix of caution and bravery Robert knew too well. A posture just a bit too rigid, like Juliet's when she felt watched. Simon Carlyle. "Good morning," he said, far too polite for his age. Politeness was armor. Juliet stepped forward. "Hello, Simon," she said, her smile trembling but unbroken. He tilted his head, trying to understand why 2 strangers were looking at him as though witnessing a miracle. "Are you here for me?" he asked plainly. "Why?" Juliet tried to speak. No sound came, so she reached into her pocket, took out the brooch, silver glinting in the boy's wide eyes, and opened her hand before him. "Because," she said at last, "someone very stubborn tucked a brooch just like this into your clothes the day you were born, and I've been searching for you ever since." Mrs. Fletcher opened the box beside them, revealing the other brooch. Simon's eyes widened. "They're the same." Robert stepped beside Juliet. "They are," he said, "because you are our son, Simon." A profound silence swallowed the room. Simon blinked, as if the sentence entered his mind too slowly. "My parents?" The word broke Juliet. She knelt before him, her hands trembling, but steady enough to reach. "I never abandoned you," she whispered, tears sliding freely. "You were taken from me the moment you were born. Your father was deceived. I've spent 10 years trying to find you." Robert knelt beside her. "We would never have chosen to leave you," he said. "Never." Simon drew one breath, then another, and then his eyes filled with tears. The first sob was small. The second was not. Juliet opened her arms. He hesitated only a heartbeat, then threw himself against her, clutching the fabric of her dress as though anchoring himself to the only solid thing in a collapsing world. Robert wrapped his arms around them both. He felt the boy's breath, the real weight of him, the life of him, the miracle of him. 10 years of silence would not vanish in a single embrace. But for the first time since youth, something inside Robert began to align, not healing, not complete peace, but a beginning, a family. Chapter 9. Rebuilding what was lost. Juliet couldn't let go of Simon. Even after his sobs softened, even after Mrs. Fletcher stepped out to give them privacy, she kept him pressed against her, as if loosening her hold by even a breath might make him vanish again. He smelled of simple soap and clean wool, a scent so ordinary and so miraculous. When she finally eased back enough to see him, Juliet felt the air leave her lungs. There was Robert in the amber eyes, in the firm line of a still childish jaw, in the slight furrow of the brow. And there was her in the delicate nose, the soft mouth, the long fingers gripping hers with awkward determination. He was real, alive, the boy she had searched for in nightmares and daybreaks, the boy she lost and found. I thought... Simon tried to speak, his voice a thin, trembling thread. I thought no one wanted me, that I was left here because I was... wrong. The words cut through Juliet like a blade. No, she whispered, steady even through her tears. Never. You were taken from me hours after you were born. I fought, every day I fought, to find you. He lifted his damp gaze to Robert. And you? Why didn't you look for me? Robert closed his eyes for a moment, breathing like a man gathering courage from old wounds. Because I didn't know you existed, Simon, he said, voice low and torn. Your grandfather forced me away. I left believing she had forgotten me, and never imagining there was a child. If I had known... His voice broke. If I had known about you, not the whole world could have dragged me away. Simon studied him with a seriousness far older than 10 years. Then slowly he reached out his hand. For a heartbeat, Robert simply froze, unable, unwilling to believe it. Then he took that small hand between his own. Something settled between them. Not reunion, recognition. What happens now? Simon asked, looking from one to the other. Do I go with you? Juliet and Robert exchanged a glance, one of those silent conversations filled with decisions too large for words. If you want to, Juliet answered. You'll have a home, a room. A name you won't have to hide. But if you need time, I don't need time, he said quickly. I've waited 10 years. It was you I was missing. Juliet pulled him back into her embrace, and Robert wrapped his arms around both of them, closing the circle that never should have been broken. The door opened. Mrs. Fletcher entered, and behind her Mrs. Davies. The older woman brought a hand to her mouth at the sight. My lady, she whispered, eyes shining. You found him. We found him, Juliet corrected, looking at Robert. Together. Mrs. Fletcher composed herself. There are formalities before he can leave. Documents, records, and the contribution due for the years he's been in our care and to help with the children who remain. You'll have everything, Robert said without hesitation. Simon squeezed Juliet's hand. I want to go, he said simply. Mrs. Fletcher smiled, faint but warm. Then go say your goodbyes, she said, touching his shoulder, and come back quickly. When he slipped out, the room suddenly felt wide and strangely quiet. Juliet turned to Robert. For the first time, she truly saw him, not the boy who left, not the shadow who hurt her, but the man shaped by hardship, scarred by truth and still capable of coming back. Thank you, she murmured. Robert frowned slightly. For what? For not running from the truth. For being here. Ferret's trying. He drew a breath as if her words cracked something inside him. We can't go back to what we were, Juliet. That love was too young to survive the world. I know, she said softly. But maybe something new can grow now. Something less naive. Stronger. Robert nodded slowly. If that's not enough, then we'll be good parents to Simon. Together or apart, but never absent. Not again. Footsteps returned down the hallway. Simon came in with a small suitcase and red-rimmed eyes. Is everything all right? He asked, hesitant. Yes, they both answered at once. 3 smiles appeared. Imperfect. Beautiful. The documents were signed. The donation made. Hartley House slipped behind them. In the carriage, Simon sat between them. His head was held high, but Juliet noticed the faint tremble in his hands. Fear and hope tangled together. Will I have a room of my own? He asked quietly. You will, Juliet said, and we can decorate it together. And books, he whispered. Adventure ones, Robert laughed softly, as many as your mother allows. When they reached Mayfair, Juliet led him to the room. He stepped inside slowly, as if walking into a dream. It's mine? He murmured. Really mine? Really? Robert said from the doorway. Simon turned toward them. His voice wavered. Can I call you mother and father? He swallowed. Or is it too soon? Juliet fell to her knees and wrapped him in a fierce embrace. Please, she whispered. Please, yes. Robert leaned down and encircled them both, forming a new, fragile, precious bond. They stayed there, held together in a room that no longer felt empty, and Juliet understood. They could not reclaim the past, but they could build what remained. A future. Epilogue. London, 1857. Juliet woke to the sound of laughter drifting in from the garden. For a moment, she stayed still beneath the early light, breathing in the calm and allowing herself simply to listen. Simon's laughter, stronger now after 6 months of steady meals, steady routines, and steady love, mingled with Robert's deeper laugh. They were practicing fencing. Robert had insisted on teaching him, despite Juliet's reservations about placing any kind of weapon in the hands of a boy still learning to trust the world. But watching them, father and son stitching 10 lost years together through discipline, play, and small triumphs, had dissolved every objection. Simon had blossomed. The quiet, watchful child from Hartley House had slowly become a lively, curious one, filling the home with questions, footsteps, laughter that echoed through the halls, and stories that never quite ended. There were still shadows, the occasional nightmare, sudden silences, old fears of abandonment that surfaced without warning. But each day they came less often. Each day more light moved into the spaces where survival had once lived alone. Juliet dressed with Mrs. Davies's help, the woman now wearing a gentleness Juliet hadn't seen in nearly a decade, and stepped into the cool morning air. She found Robert and Simon in the grass, sleeves rolled to their elbows despite the cold wooden foils in hand. "Guard your center, Simon. Always protect your middle line," Robert instructed, firm but patient. Simon copied the movement, clumsy but determined. When he spotted Juliet, he broke into a grin so bright it warmed her to her bones. "Mother, look! Father's teaching me to fight like a knight. Mother, father." The word still moved her every time they left his lips. Juliet crossed the lawn and kissed the top of his head. "I see that. Very impressive." Her gaze found Robert's, so different now from the young man she had loved at 16. There was something steadier in him, something shaped not by impulse but by the quiet work of becoming someone better. He smiled at her, and Juliet felt something open inside her, places she thought were nothing but scar tissue. "I have news," he said when Simon returned to practice. "The Crimson Lion had its best month since I opened it. James is talking about expanding, maybe even opening a second house." Juliet knew that look, torn between the life he'd built in the shadows and the hope of something brighter for their son. "And what do you want?" she asked softly. Robert hesitated, then allowed a guarded part of himself to surface. "For years I've supported St. Catherine's," he confessed, "and a few smaller homes, places that take in children no one wants, children whose parents pretend they don't exist. I've helped with money, sometimes with work. I've thought about doing more." Juliet went still. He had never told her. "Robert, I don't do it out of noble charity," he said quietly, with a shy smile that seemed impossible on him. "I do it because I was one of those children, because I know what it is to grow up without a name, without protection. If a place like St. Catherine's had existed for me, maybe things would have been different." His eyes drifted toward Simon. "And now I know my own son lived that same reality I tried to spare other children from." His voice cracked softly. "Knowing that makes it more personal than I ever imagined." Juliet felt her breath hitch. In that moment she knew, with a deep, certain clarity, who Robert truly was, the kind of man who saved children long before he knew he had lost his own. "That's extraordinary," she said, touching his arm. "You are extraordinary. No title could make you more noble than that." Something softened in his gaze, something he rarely let anyone see. Simon ran up to them then, interrupting the moment. "Can I have pie for breakfast?" "Absolutely not," Juliet said, feigning scandal, then smiled. "Perhaps for supper?" Simon made a face, laughed, and dashed back inside, likely to recruit Mrs. Davies for his cause. Robert stepped closer. 6 months, he murmured. It feels impossible that we found him such a short time ago. And more impossible still that we lost him for 10 years, Juliet replied. But we're rebuilding, one day at a time. He took her hands. Juliet, there's something I need to say. Her heart tightened. Say it. When we met again in Whitechapel, I was full of anger, he admitted, believing you had abandoned me, believing you had chosen to forget. But these months, with you and Simon, he drew a breath. I don't feel any of that anymore. Only gratitude. And something else. Something growing every day. Quieter. Deeper. Tears warmed her eyes. I feel it too, Robert. I'm not the boy who once promised to run away with you, he said. But I am the father of your child. And I'm the man who is falling in love with you again, not with the girl you were, but with the woman you are now. Juliet smiled, a full, healed smile. Then let me answer before you stumble over pretty words, she said. Yes, yes, I will marry you. Robert laughed, a rare, beautiful sound, and bent to kiss her. It wasn't the stolen kiss of the greenhouse, nor the desperate one of dark reunions. It was a vow, a promise, a beginning. Simon appeared at the doorway, eyes widening. Mrs. Davies! They're getting married, I told you they would. Does that mean I'll get siblings? Robert shot Juliet a playful look. She laughed into his chest. Eventually, she said. But Simon was already bouncing with joy, wrapping his arms around both their waists. So we're a real family now? Juliet held him close. We always were, but now it's official. Robert gathered them both into a tight embrace, and for the first time in his life, he felt exactly where he belonged. As Simon chatted excitedly, about cake and new clothes and inviting every child from Hartley House to the ceremony, Juliet and Robert exchanged a long, quiet glance. A glance of partnership, of love renewed, of everything that had survived. It was the end of 10 years of pain, and the beginning of everything. Their future, imperfect, mended, real, began there, in a sunlit London garden, with the family they once believed lost forever. And for the first time, Juliet believed without hesitation. Happy endings existed. Not the fairy tale kind, the real kind, born not of perfection, but of choice, born of the love that endures. If this story touched you, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps our tales live a little longer in this world. Thank you for watching.